So Jon Adams is going to give a short talk, and then Simon Baron-Cohen will talk. We may take a few questions immediately after Jon's, but what I'd like to do is keep the main part of the discussion until after both talks. I also just wanted to add, which I omitted at the beginning, and this is quite important, that Grey 1 and 2, which were the pieces that you just saw, a collaboration between Jon Adams and also Lucas Holzhauer, who is at the back there. So, thank you, Lucas. I'm going to hand over to Jon.
Thank you. Is that loud enough? Is that okay? Good. I'm going to rattle through these quite quickly. And I do apologise for standing in your way. If I go here, that's a bit better, isn't it? Two little boys. I'll come back to that one. But that was from a project that started all this LARP off. I've always been a bit of a radical, and this was a piece of artwork where I took my old school reports and redacted them. It was at the time when the MPs were redacting theirs, but I cut all the good bits out. I was very highly told off at school because I specialised too quick. I was told I specialised too quick. Now, you wouldn't say that to a 50-year-old professor who was expert and would have issued echinoderms, that he specialises too much, would you? The last one was my pen. It was actually my school pen from school, which I altered, let's say, to make it unwritable with, because I am very dyslexic. But that wasn't picked up at school at all. And after I left, I can draw. So these are the sorts of books that I used to draw from. Very highly systemised, very highly accurate. And they would tell me to do one thing, and that's exactly what I would do. And because I made them so detailed, they'd have to make me promise that I didn't hide things in them, which I did. This was the first attempt I had of describing how I felt when I first found out I was dyslexic at the age of 40. I had been drawing a few pictures for Liberties at the time, but this says it much better. And this is a piece for a gallery I did about 5 years ago, where I wanted it to look like I walked in there and just shed my skin. Because of the bullying I had at school, that's sometimes how I like to feel about myself. I'd like to just peel it all off and let it go. I do find patterns in a lot of things. These are bits of chewing gum on Brighton Station. And the names, they wouldn't let me do it at first. So I went around with the camera facing down. I learned how to do that in Romania because I went on one of the aid trips and I was followed every 10 foot behind by a Stasi person. And I soon learned how to take photographs without looking like I was taking photographs. But what I did was I also used the randomness of Google to name each one too. So, I have a fascination with tables. This is a periodic table, but it's been altered too. And it's all about various aspects of disability, let's say. And it's called the $6 Million Man after someone who wore hearing aids and was called $6 Million Man at school because they look so obvious. I like sequences of things, and digital artwork appeals to me because I can both randomise it and find patterns, which is what I've done with the music from words, which I'll come on to later. I am going to rattle through these. One of the first things I did when I kind of came out in 2005, 2006, I was very, very, very shy before then. And I did everybody else's pictures and not my own till that point. And then from then on, I've made my own artwork. This was, and I didn't realise what I was doing at the time, but I got transfixed. I was on Southern Railways working as their artist, mapping people's journeys because I thought that was the hardest thing I could do. Sit on a train and talk to people. And I got transfixed by the different types of bags in the trees outside. So one journey I just mapped all the different bags. Didn't go down too well. So I started changing the signs on the railway. Yes, there were a couple of different. Let me sit down. So, There were a couple of different versions of this. There was rain, pain, and sane. And I didn't get caught. I got encouraged for 3 weeks and was asked to stop. I've also put up notices at other places. This is Trafalgar Square, which I declared a no spelling zone. I put a giant notice up, which I don't think I've got on here. It said I can't spell, but I spelt it wrong. You can imagine. And here, I just tend to leave things places. That's Pallet House. I walked in and just left a book on the floor and combed it off. And the other one was for the Cultural Impaired, 2008. I was very lucky enough to fill part of the crack at the turbine hole with Scrabble letters, very wooden horse-ish. I just had them in my pocket and would stand over it and let them go. And I did a piece with an artist who's here, and I played the sound of seagulls. Because of my synesthesia, every time I've gone into that space, I hear seagulls. So I thought it's about time everyone else did. So for the day, we played the sound of seagulls on the hour 5 times. Everybody came out and looked. And I put a piece of tape on the floor with yellow. I can't stand yellow, it makes me feel ill. And I put some yellow tape on the floor and they said you can do anything you want in chalk and tape the sound, as long as you don't damage the floor. And when I took the tape up, it cleaned it, so the line is still there. Oh dear. This is a sound piece I made out of stones. I love stones. Stones kind of don't let you down. And I've always had that love of stones rather than people. In fact, I still draw them. There we go. And even when I mix them up with other projects, I'm still after looking at the stones and the types of stones that are there. This was a project for the Cultural Impaired, which is still carrying on. We're going over to France next year to plant thousands of flags in commemoration of D-Day. And there we are, Fratton Pub. Very brief overview of what I used to do. Now, I like kind of sneaking and changing and metamorphosising things, and throughout the residency I found out why. Again, I'll come on to that later. This was a show I did at Pallet House, and they said you can have the print room, and what would you like to do? And off the top of my head I said I would do a geological interpretation of my life story, so I did. And that was seen. And I put lots and lots of fossils on display from my early childhood. And out of that I was commissioned to map the cultural impact in the southeast in geological metaphor, which is where Nicola asked me to go and talk about that project after hearing me talk at SHAPE about my science art residency with the Leaf Hume Trust. Fascination with repeating clocks, it sets us different time. And throughout the project, I've been collecting fossils. That astronomy book is actually signed by Patrick Moore, so I was going to make that into flags, but I couldn't bear to. So every day I collected just items and represented them, including hair groups. I'm zoning the whole lot on the hair groups. I've got about 4,000. And then some of them were shown in a cabinet of curiosities. In there, bits ranging from the last bun my mum ever ate to bits I've just found on the floor and the death notice of the teacher who bullied me at school. And there I was presented at Kaleidoscope, the final exhibition. But every day I wrote down everything I did, and I still do. So for 4 years now, I've written everything I did down, and they get turned into diagrams like this, and then correlated. So if I visit the same project 7 times, I have 7 well maps like this. And from that you can infer stories. There we go. This one's very relevant for 2 reasons. One was a very boring Guildford transport meeting where I got fascinated by the guy going, so I mapped those all the time. And the second one is the day I first went to Cambridge to meet Simon. And there was a woman on the train shouting, So they're actually from the same time period, or will be. And there's some more maps. I was asked to do a very brief thing for Liberty Festival at Royal Festival Hall when I wrapped their pillars. But there's lots of things hidden in those nice, bland-looking, innocent things. But there we go. But at the same time, I was gathering photographs too. I see patterns in everyday items, and these are the things that I change with the computer to almost make maps. They could be any scale. These are actually really small. And this one here is on show at a neurological conference in Seattle at the moment. So how did that lead to the project with Simon? Like I said, Nicola heard some of my work. She was a judge on a science, art science project quite a while ago in 2009. And my first time at the university, I was placed in cosmology. Ever since I was a young kid, I've asked two questions: what's above us and what's below us? Insatiable curiosity. Even though I couldn't read about the landscape, I could read it. But I love cosmology, and my dad did a talk. So being placed in cosmology just seemed very natural. I'm at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to art and science, because I don't see any difference. So when people say, how do you mix art and science, I think, well, I don't know, they already are. So to me, it just seems very natural. So I made 3 pieces of music, from photographs to supernovas. And that's what I put into the London show, and Nicola heard. And I make my sound work by sculpting using granular synthesis, which just means you turn everything into vast clouds of fragments and reassemble them. And I actually put that up there before Brian Cobbs. Because that's from 2009. So I was asked by Nicola, would I do a talk for her? And I said yes. Didn't know where the talk was or who the talk was with. I just said yes, which was a bit brave of me, because I normally don't do that sort of thing, but I just had this feeling that it was going to be good, it was going to be alright. So, next thing I know, a couple of months beforehand, was it's A. Cheltenham Science Festival. I nearly died, because I never had the chance to go, and it was marvellous. And B, it was talking with Simon. I hadn't really been aware of my Asperger's until I started doing work with young people with dyslexia. And one of the people said to me, had you thought, by the way you are, that you might be Asperger's? So I had to look into this. I had to ask lots of questions, do lots of research, and of course Simon's name came up. So when I was told about Simon, I knew who he was. I nearly died. So I met Simon on stage, very reassuring, and we both did our talks. And they were surprisingly correlated, let's say, which to me was quite joyous. This is actually the Lookabout Day because it was part of the period that I'd been mapping. So Simon invited me to go to Cambridge not long after that, 1st of August. And I became fixated by one very, very quick phrase. I'd never heard of the word systemising before. I didn't realise that I just kind of did it. And there was a phrase used in a paper, and it said input, action, output. And it just triggered off and fired off tons of stuff in my head, namely the synthesizer. Because you put an input into something, you perform an action, and you get an output. I kind of like that. Almost no repetition is unnecessary. You can perform that same action 10 times and get the same thing out. I can drop a stone 10 times and I know it'll hit the floor and bounce and go somewhere. The randomness is another part of the rule, but I know I can drop it, won't fly and hit the ceiling. Trouble is, if I say the same thing to 10 different people, I might get 10 different answers. I can't really cope with that. If I say the one that's worse than that, if I say the same thing to one person and get 10 different answers, that's absolute hell. So the idea for the project of working together to look and show, and for me, it has revalued my thinking as an autistic person, let alone anyone else's. The project was there to revalue autistic thinking, and I know that I have, because I've never really known why I do certain things, and finding out now why I can't cope with a blank sheet of paper, but give me a wooden floor and I'll turn it into anything. And I always thought that was a deficit of mine, that I wasn't creative. But that's not true. So one of the first images I did for the whole project, rather nervously, I went to Cambridge. Hotels can be a bit of a nightmare. It's all in the blog at the back. I decided at the very last minute to keep a blog. Again, another useful thing for a dyslexic. But then I have an iPhone that I can talk into, and it writes lots of things. Sometimes not quite what you say. I get fascinated by the word choices. Yeah, there's another obsession. The first day I walked in, I crossed the road and I saw a pattern in the white line that divided the cycle lane from the path. And I made this from it, which was kind of I was very nervous till that point, but when I saw this pattern and I thought how brain-like it looked, it made me at ease. And that's just another reworking of it. And from that moment on, I decided to take more pictures of everyday things and change them into a series of images that we could use for the residency. That's just plain ordinary seaweed. That's probably one of the more obvious ones, but to me, all these things started to be related to what I was reading about and talking to neuroscientists about. I don't normally work in colour, I normally work in black and white. But this project has enabled me to work in colour, which has been very strange. That's just bed sheets, by the way. I probably shouldn't give all these out. That's the top of a table. And this is one of the tiles in the bathroom in the hotel I stayed in, which I did fixate about. Oh, we changed there. That's an early picture of me. The tiles I'll come back to. Oh, it suddenly decided to have a mind episode and change them automatically. This is the Barbican Centre carpet, just round the corner. I won't tell you what that one is. These are the tiles in the bathroom of the hotel, which I actually photographed all 360 rows and have turned into a piece of music based on the different shades of colour and pattern. So all this has been documented in the blog, and I have had post-traumatic stress disorder, which is why the project was delayed slightly. So I've been working my way through that. So the whole blog maps both the visits to Cambridge and the recovery from post-traumatic stress disorder, which has its correlations with certain parts of the brain, and Asperger's. MRI noise, one of the first things that I looked at, and cutting small segments out, and then putting those segments into a synthesizer. On a computer, digital, I'm going from digital back to analog, which is very strange when most people are going from analog to digital now. I just see digital as just being another tool like a pencil that you can use to make well in my case with this, it's to make the sounds that I can hear in my head but I can't hear in the real world. So that's how I made the sound for field of fragments. Fragments are very important to me. It's about putting puzzles together, it's about putting things together and making different pictures and patterns, which is why I tend to write about fragments, or that's why I've called the SoundCloud site. Now, an analogy for systems. This is a system. It interacts with the world. You put an input in, which could be a key press, or you could speak into it, or you could plug a cello into it. There are ways of doing that. And you perform an action and you get an output. it's an enclosed system. So I've been reading and doing an awful lot of research on what is a system. These are our systems that we've got at the back. And I feel I've probably touched about 1,000. The manual is huge. The manual is about 5 or 6 inches thick. But it took me nearly 6 months and probably 150 diagrams to work out what I needed. So I had to systemize the system, and I had to look at each individual component and learn what that did, to put it together next to something else, next to something else, next to something else. It kind of breaks all the rules because I should get lost in the detail of each individual item. But as an analogy for Asperger's, the synthesizer is no good unless you can get sound out of it. In which case I've got to know how each piece fits into the bigger picture. So I've got to know how to wire it up to make a sound, which kind of bucks a few rules, let's say. And just looking at this, the system is composed of parts, yes. You can go down, I won't do that now because we're short of time. But the last one I kind of like. A system consists of processes that transform inputs into outputs. And I kind of find that very true for both the synthesizer and for myself. Ooh. Okay. I just need rescuing from that bit. We're very near the end of what I'm going to talk about. Here we go. So this is what I mean. I've got to know what each individual part does and the complexities of each individual system. And I've got to know how it all goes together. How, let's start this off. You put an action in and that triggers lots of other actions where you have to start wiring it all up. And it kind of fits into a complex system too. And that's our complex system. Very, very, very briefly, I've also been looking at how I can show in score form some of the bits that are up on the wall there. It's been very high. I've taken words and I've given note values to words. And I've done some very complicated, I love maths, and I've done some very complicated 12-tone interpretation of words. But I've actually done it as 8 notes, so I've done it in a different scale, just to be difficult. So I'm looking at different ways of representing that too. And the piece of music, some of the piece of music for grade 2 was actually the hormone oxytocin. So instead of having to make up nice pieces of music, passages of music, I've just taken a list of words. And I also gave these words out to people at art to join up in different ways, so I knew, and then I've metamorphosed those into wiring diagrams. So there's different ways of showing the 8 notes. But one of the exciting things is, if you take an EEG, it's just voltage. The synthesizer at the back just works on voltage. So I'm looking at ways of plugging people straight into the synthesizer to control it. And that idea was given to me the very first visit. I saw a picture on the wall in the PhD lab that was drawn and nobody knew where it came from. So I reinterpreted it. But Look About, which was the Olympics one, supported by those. And this project has been very kindly supported by Wellcome Trust, commissioned by Arts Catalyst. I'm very proud to be working with art. Before I finish, there's that tabletop. There's those bed sheets, and there's that original image of the pavement. Thank you.
Do you want to take a couple of questions?
I'm happy to take a couple of
Will
questions.
anybody? Yes. Okay.
What about the first image of the 2 little boys you said you'd come back to?
You said we come back to
The 2 little boys.
When I was 6,
Like
I was,
you and a boy.
when I was 6, I was happy. Okay, and then when I went to school, I wasn't. At the age of 11, all I could do was draw. I couldn't read and write. All I could do was draw. And one of the teachers asked me to write my name on this picture. And I wrote my name, and my name's not Jon, it's Jonathan, and there's 7 at least different ways of saying that. So I tried my best because I knew if I asked him for help, he would say can't even spell his own name, and that would cause a lot of fucking. So I did the best I could. The teacher held the picture up in front of the class and he tore it up and said, "You'll never be anything." So from that point on, I didn't draw, and I went to university and I studied geology, which was my other love, not art. So the first time I was ever in an art college was 7 years ago when I became an autism resident at the university. So the 2 pictures are me as a little boy, innocent, and the bomb came from the show which I did with cosmology. My dad said to me in an offhand comment, he was happy till he was 15, and then when they dropped the atomic bomb, he knew what that meant. Because he was a bit of a geek, into science, he knew what atomic theory was at the age of 15, and that everybody else from that day forward would live under the shadow of the bomb. And it's one of those moments that you can't change and go back, which I've often done quite a bit of artwork about. So me as a kid, smiling happy, not knowing what's coming. But having said that, I wouldn't change it, because I wouldn't be standing here now.
Great. I wanted to ask you about your relationship to different ways of making, and whether when you change to a different form, when you change to a different mode, that you're, in a way, you're attached with a different way. How does it make you feel moving from one form to another?
I've book illustrated for 25 years, 30 years. And then I woke up one morning and I decided I wasn't going to draw anybody else's pictures. I wasn't going to make artwork that pleased other people. I was going to make stuff that I wanted to make. And you know, as a person with Asperger's, it was black and white. I either do or I don't. And that was the day. And I thought, well, if people like what I make, that's great. If people hate it, that's great. But if they ignore it, that's I have a little bit different to you. So literally, I follow my nose, I follow my intuition, I do what I feel is right now. And I've been so busy I haven't looked back and thought about it.
Yeah, it's just something that, as an artist, a lot of artists do think about. So that's why I'm asking you, because I think it's something, if it's pertinent, and if it's something that you also have a worry or an interest in, would that also change the way that you approach it? I know as an artist who doesn't have Asperger, I have those kind of worries. Where I know what I'm dealing with is a very different type of material. It's a very different type of process. So I don't understand those feelings. How am I going to put my words on that?
I try and find patterns, I try and find commonality. And it will just come out of the blue very naturally and I'll go, that's the way to go. If I try and think, what am I going to do, it won't work. But if I shut my eyes and I put it onto the back burner, it'll just come, it'll just happen. If I try too hard, if I try and be clever, it won't work. I try and find a pattern, try and find a sequence, try and find something to follow.
There's another question. Sorry, I think what explained before was very interesting. I just want to know, like, you talk about system, because people respond to your artwork, you can't, it's very unpredictable. And I wonder how you deal with it. And how do you make a system out of that? Or?
I like having fun with people.
It is very unpredictable, and I know you try to find pattern in unpredictability.
I like the patterns. I like other people to see what they want to see in it. And I like that unpredictability. I don't know whether that answers it fully. I find joy in chaos sometimes. Because there are rules to it.
Okay, I know there are other questions, but just because of time, I'm going to move on, and then Jon will be around afterwards if there are more questions after we officially finish as well. But for now, I want to introduce Professor Simon Baron-Cohen. He's the director of the Autism Research Centre in Cambridge, who I first heard speaking maybe 12 years ago, and it's one of those things that comes around, that you actually have the opportunity
to want to remove the blood from someone. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So I want to start just by saying that it's been a real privilege for me to work with Jon. As you heard, he came to work at Cambridge University, where I'm based, at the Autism Research Centre. Actually, during the process of his residency, he got his diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, but he already had a sort of self-diagnosis. He identified with it, and you've heard that he's got a number of other conditions, let's call them. One is synesthesia, a mixing of the senses. The other one is dyslexia, and he's also talked about his post-traumatic stress disorder, just surviving a very unhappy childhood. What I was going to do in the next 15 minutes is just talk about a view of autism that perhaps puts his work into some context of what we do in the research centre. And you can see I've come up with this title, Autism Patterns and Systemising. So systemising is a term that we've already talked quite a lot about. Jon's talked about his love of patterns, but we were looking at this concept of systemising before I met Jon, and actually I think his work has enriched our work. So I want to thank you, Jon, for helping us kind of understand this concept a bit clearer. So let's start with this little boy. So he's got autism, and you can see that he's playing with water, and he is fascinated by patterns, that as you put your hand in the flow of water, you're breaking the flow in different ways. And it's an example of just what some people would say becoming obsessed by, in this case, a natural system, the patterns of water droplets. And a lot of children that we see in the clinic, if you ask the parents what's their favourite toy, they'll say he loves to play with Lego, and he'll play with it in his bedroom for hours and hours, all day. So solitary play. But again, Lego is one of those toys that lends itself to making patterns in a possibly infinite number of combinations. This boy with autism is doing something very, very classic. It's almost diagnostic, mainly lining things up. He's got his little toy cars, but he's lining them up to make a sequence, again, of repeating patterns. Kids with autism get very upset if someone comes along and disturbs their pattern, which obviously makes it difficult for the rest of the family. But you can see a theme emerging, which is this very strong love of patterns. This was the drawing, or the scribbling almost, of an Italian girl called Lisa Perini. And what you notice is that it's very repetitive. She's sort of obsessed with the shape that looks like a W. And in a lot of schools schools for children with autism, teachers, at least in the old days, and maybe this is still true, discouraged kids from this very repetitive behaviour, thinking that it's stopping the child from being more flexible and being more open to new topics. The child does the same thing over and over again. When she was 4 years old, she just filled her notebook with the letter W, and the impression it gives, obviously, as a child is very limited. But this is her, as an adult, her work, so that early repetition maybe gave her the skills to be a really very accomplished artist as an adult. And it would be very hard to predict that adult outcome. But I think it's giving us a clue to the learning style of people with autism, that they learn through repetition, sometimes leading to mastery. And I think you've sort of heard a similar story with Jon. This is the work by another person with autism who's an artist. He's called Peter Myers, and he loves visual patterns. You can see that he's sort of playing with visual illusions here, but just like with Jon's work, there's a kind of focus on detail and on repetition, but trying to explore what's interesting about it. This is another piece by the same artist, and we produced a book collecting his work together with the title An Exact Mind, that people with autism like precision, and all those small details, every dot matters in terms of its position and its colour and its shape and so forth. So these are sort of visual patterns which sometimes I think become great art. This is a man called Kevin Phillips, who has Asperger's syndrome, and he's not using his love of patterns for art. His obsession is the weather, so it's a natural system. He goes out into his garden every night at midnight, and he writes in his notebooks information about the date, the day of the month, and then information about the weather. How much rainfall there's been, the temperature, the wind speed, and other meteorological data. And his house is crammed full of thousands of these notebooks. He's got to go out at the same time, in the same place, so he can't go on holiday, in case he misses a day, because he wants to record this information systematically. He's not a professional meteorologist, but he's nevertheless looking for patterns in the natural environment, in this case the weather. So it's a different expression, I think, of the same drive for looking for patterns. Looking for patterns needs good attention to detail, and one of the things that we do at the Autism Research Centre is give tests like the one on the left, where you have to find the cube as quickly as you can, hidden in the overall design. So it's a test of your attention to detail. People with autism are super quick on these tests, and we also ask them sometimes to do that in the MRI scanner. You saw an example of it in Jon's presentation. Finding in a number of different studies that the brain in people with autism shows less activity in parts of the visual cortex when they're searching for the target shape as quickly as they can, compared to a typical brain. So even though they're more accurate and faster at spotting the details, they're actually using less activity in the brain to accomplish that. So it's showing differences in parts of the visual cortex. We've talked quite a lot about vision, but tonight is a very sort of multi-sensory artistic event. This is another man with autism, Derek Harivacini, who is blind, but he also has autism. And he can play any song that he hears after hearing it just once. He's become a very accomplished musician, even though he's got a mental age of a 4-year-old. And when he's been tested by psychologists, if you play him any chord with up to 10 notes, he can name each note in the chord instantly. So he can hear how a sound is composed. He can decompose a complex sound into its individual components. So it's an example of patterns in sound. And this is showing you that when neuroscientists look at the brain in people with autism when they're listening to sounds, there's evidence for greater activity in the auditory cortex in people with autism compared to a typical brain. So as they're hearing just small sounds being played whilst they're lying in the scanner, they're showing what I've called a hypersensitive response in their hearing. So they pick out detail very quickly, in this case in the auditory domain. So this is this concept of systemizing. Another way of thinking about it is identifying patterns or regularities. And what I've put up here are 3 different types of system. On the bottom there we've got a mechanical system like a car engine, where you're trying to figure out how the system works. Up on the top right we've got a barometer, so the weather as an example of a natural system, where you're trying to use an instrument to predict how the system works. And on the left top we've got a collection of books in a library which are systematically organised, like someone's catalogued them in a systematic way, perhaps alphabetical or by topic or by author. All of these are examples of systems all around us, and this data down here shows a study we carried out asking people with autism in blue how strong their interests were in these different kinds of systems, and people in the general population shown in red. And you can see that people with autism have a much stronger interest in systems. That's to do with questionnaire studies, but we've also asked people with autism to solve little physics tasks, as an example of a mechanical system, where you have to predict what that point P will do when the wheel rotates anti-clockwise. And we found that teenagers with Asperger's syndrome are better on this test of understanding mechanics than a typical group of teenagers. So it's not just about their report of their love of systems, but it actually translates into an aptitude that although they've got the disability, which John's described to you, makes social situations very challenging. When you give them tasks that play to their strengths, they actually outperform a typical group. So we must remember that autism also involves disability. People with autism have difficulty in imagining other people's thoughts and feelings, maybe because that world is not so precise and not so lawful and predictable. John described that a little bit. Sometimes that's called theory of mind difficulties. And this is a study that was carried out at Yale University, where they used what's called a gaze tracker. It monitors where you're looking. And in red is the viewing pattern of people with autism when they're watching a movie. This film is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? And you can see that in yellow are typical individuals who tend to look at Elizabeth Taylor's eyes, but people with autism tend to look not at the eyes but at the mouth when they're looking at her face, because perhaps the eyes are quite confusing. People's eyes move a lot, they contain a lot of information about emotions, but they're very difficult to systemize, whereas people's mouths tend to follow the sounds that they're making a bit more predictable. And this just shows you that neuroscience has been looking at these social disabilities in autism, finding that there isn't a single part of the brain that underlies them. There's a network of different regions that are circled in red here, which these are regions which are used by the typical individual to understand other people, to understand social situations. And these are regions of the brain which are underactive in people with autism. So people with autism are not the only people who love patterns, so do mathematicians. John talked a bit about his love of maths, but this is just one example of the beauty in numerical patterns, but it leads to a prediction, which is that maybe in universities where people study mathematics, we might find a higher rate of autism compared to people studying other subjects. So we looked at that in Cambridge, and what you can see is that there was a much higher rate of autism amongst maths students in the university compared to students in other disciplines. And I took this as very good news in terms of a piece of research, because it was also demonstrating that for people with autism, they can use their strengths to, in some ways, overcome their disability and fulfill their potential, in this case academically. So I want to finish just with one last individual. This is a little boy, 10-year-old boy called Max Park, who's obsessed with another kind of system, the Rubik Cube. Kids with autism often like this as a toy, just like Lego. But in the case of Max, at the age of 10 years old, he was able to solve a 6x6 Rubik Cube in under 3 minutes. So you can randomly shuffle it, give it to him, and he can get it back into regular patterns very, very quickly, and he became one of the top 100 players in the world. So these are, in some ways, you might think of them as, are they important skills? But I think they're giving us a window into the mind of people with autism, their love of patterns, which often translates into skill and talent. And my final slide here is just to tell you that on the disability side of autism, the government in this country passed the Autism Act in 2009, just recognising that people like John often have a very difficult journey into adulthood. They get bullied at school, they often get depression because they're not fitting into a social group, not benefiting from social support. And the recognition that there are a lot of adults in our society who've had that rough journey and who need services, need support, led to this piece of legislation. And out of that has come something from the Department of Health called the Autism Strategy, which is still being rolled out, where different services are being set up around the country to support people like Jon. And we're very lucky that in Cambridge we've got a clinic with services for adults with Asperger syndrome, and Jon is helping us to design those. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions for Simon, or indeed for Jon, would you like to? Yes.
I wondered if you could just reflect a little bit on the effect on you of working with a neuroscientist or a neuropsychologist. It seems to me to introduce the possibility of a new kind of method or a methodology for art-science interactions in which the science becomes a method for self-discovery or self-understanding and self-realization for you as an artist, rather than perhaps the more conventional approach, which is that the artist somehow either contributes to the science through a kind of fusion or publicizes it effectively. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that. That seemed to be quite an interesting way of going about things, or an interesting effect.
Yeah, like I said before, I have this difficulty where I don't see a difference between arts and science. So when I approach, working with a scientist, it's just like being with someone, just like being with someone, really. I don't go in there thinking, he's a scientist, and let that colour it. I wanted to go in and find out who they were, what they were doing, why they did it. And then, look for clues and patterns and directions I could take things from. And yes, it's deeply changed me. Like I said, the title of the project was Revaluing and Rethinking Autistic Thinking. And to be honest, before I did this project, I didn't value my own thinking. And now I do, greatly. So in effect, that's an effect it's had on me. And it's been, I wanted to find out what these people did. I wanted to find out what they were as personable people. And, which sounds very strange coming from someone with Asperger's. You might want to, ignore all that bit and just look for pure science and think, well, how can I make something very literal out of that? Well, I didn't want to make it. I do make literal things, but I make literal things one step removed. And what I didn't want to do, like when Simon showed the slide, with the mouth covered in red, it's almost like you're hanging on every word. Because I know that when I watch a film, I watch people's mouths. I want to see and look at the words. So I'm learning all the time about me. And to work with the neuroscientists was great. They're all very cultured people. Highly cultured people, music, fine art. But they all have, the one thing they have in common is they want to make a difference. But then that's surely what you want to do when you're an artist too. You want to make a difference. So I heavily rely on trying not to understand in a very superficial way what I'm looking at. You can tell I don't really look at my own processes, but this has been really good at me for doing that. I just try and find clues. It's almost like when I was a kid, I had to work out ways of existing in a world that seemed 3 or 4 degrees outside of kilter for me. And that's what I took into the project. But I wanted to push myself too, like I did with the residency for Southern. I thought, what's the hardest thing I can do after having 45 years of not talking to people? Would be to talk to people on a train. He's coming to sit next to me, he's talking to me. That's what I wanted to do. So with this residency too, I wanted to push myself, and I'm not necessarily used to going away and being so engaging with people who I don't know. But I did it in a systematic method. I wrote in my book, talk to them, and wrote it down at the end of the day. And had goals and rules and achieved those, but I was very open as to what I wanted to find out. I didn't want to go in there pre-prescribed in both process, method, and what I wanted to hear. I had nothing to prove, so I didn't need to hear anything to prove what I thought. It was a blank page when I went in. No, scientists are great. And I agree with you on the one final point. A lot of people think art science is doing a fantastic poster to show what a dinosaur did 500 years ago. Or this is my specialism. It's like the poster shows at university. You know, there's a certain style to it. I really want to get away from that. It's not about showing a nice image of a brain because that's what I'm looking at. It's the brain picture came from this, came from that, came from this, came from my systematic thinking. You know, and it's been very difficult not to get obsessed about certain aspects because this is just a small pilot scheme. And looking at things that we could do and directions we could go, you know, I've had to lock down very severely and not get too carried away and see the bigger picture, really, see where each bit would fit in and the direction in which I need to go to. So it's taught me a lot.
Well, yeah, I've got a question for both Simon and Jon. I'm interested in politics of this kind of research. How do you deal with the situation where you have a researcher and a so-called subject or patient or whatever who is totally capable of making intelligent decisions, but their knowledge of the basis of the research would actually make the research not possible or effective? In other words, kind of a neuroscience experiment such as the sort that you described. How in a sense, would the scientific community deal with those political situations where, as I understand it, in certain cases, the knowledge of the research has to be held back from the subject in order to do the research?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I should just make a couple of points in response. The first is that when Jon came to our research centre, he wasn't coming as a subject of research. So he hasn't taken part in research. He's been an artist, and so the relationship hasn't been one between a researcher and a subject or participant. It's been more of a dialogue. What can we learn from each other? And in that way, it's you know, he's coming from a different perspective to me or to.
Yeah, but wouldn't his work maybe put ideas into the heads of people who are so-called subjects or patients?
Well, I mean, you know, there's no restriction on conversation. He can, you know, when we do research, we're also not trying to mislead or withhold information from people that we are studying. And actually, it's almost on the contrary. We publish and we make the results openly accessible.
Even if that skews the results?
Well, it can be inevitable. You know, so I've told you some of the results of the research today, and that could have an effect on how future people taking part in studies respond. And that is, you know, it's part of human research. It's not going to stay still. It's not like studying stones. You know, we're dealing with people who can respond, and so that's one point. I think the other thing is, you know, that you're asking about the politics of the relationship, and I think things have changed. In the old days, certainly in medical research, the person who was being studied almost had no voice, and the scientists came in and prodded and poked and put them under the microscope, or in our case, the brain scanner, but didn't really sort of ask them what they were thinking or feeling. Whereas now, I think there's much more of a desire to learn from each other, that the scientists need people with the disabilities to say, this is what my life is like, this is what my perception is like. Don't just make assumptions, you know, listen to what I'm saying. And you know, we can get clues from Jon. You know, he was a geologist, so he liked to understand about how mountains were formed and valleys were formed. So that gives us clues about his mind. We can look at his art, but actually it's great hearing him talk about it, because sometimes these pictures that he shows only give you a tiny slice of what's going on. And for me, one big thing that I learned through meeting Jon is that just as he's walking around in his everyday sort of, every journey he makes, he's spotting patterns everywhere. Probably even if you just look at the floor, we've got this wooden floor here, and most of us either just ignore it, we put it into the background, it's not relevant. But for someone with autism, just the texture and the shapes and the colours and everything must be shouting out at them. And this is something that we were kind of unaware of. As researchers, we tended to focus on the social difficulties of people with autism. We've neglected the sensory and the perceptual aspects, which make them different. So, we've learned a lot just by talking.
I'll just very briefly add that. It was smashing just having conversations. And when I went in, I thought, I'm going to be open to any questions they want to ask, so they can ask me anything. And I think at the very, very beginning, when I was getting to know some people, it was almost, they were too scared to ask me questions. But just by being there, it almost invited questions, and I hope that they would learn more by just talking to me as a non-subject than they would talking to subjects, if you see what I mean. Like Simon says about, someone can come in, do a scan, and be anonymous and answer a questionnaire, but to actually talk to someone to find out. And we had some really engaging conversations, which was really great for me, because it enabled me to look at analogies and learn tons. Some conversations just started, hello, what do you do? It went on to in-depth conversations about dyslexia and music or your own tuning. And then I'd have to go back to the hotel early because all these thousands of ideas are going through my head about what we could do. I really feel that I've only touched a mere thousandth of what the possibility and artwork and working and ideas. I almost feel like a stone skimmed across the surface. And you touch down very briefly, but you make ripples where you touch. It's, I've got a lifetime in my head of what we could do.
Is autism a medical disorder?
There's a question. So, 2 parts to your question. Is it, or maybe 3 parts, is it medical, is it a disorder, and do we want to cure it? It's medical in the sense that it arises from the brain. So, you've seen a little bit of the research that goes on, but other medical research approaches include genetics and looking at proteins in the body that are different in people with autism. Is it a disorder? Well, I don't use that term. A lot of people do, but I don't see it as a disorder. I think it's quite an ugly term. It's certainly a disability, and Jon can tell you the kinds of situations that are disabling for him. But I don't think it's a disorder in the sense that I don't think anything's broken in the brain. Disorder kind of implies that something is broken. And I just think it's a difference. It's a different pattern of development. I didn't have a chance to talk about it, but there are studies tracking children with autism across development. The brain is growing differently, it's functioning differently. And instead of seeing it as a disorder, I quite like this new concept of neurodiversity. But it's just one example of the many different ways that you can develop. And the last question, part of the question was, do we want to cure it? There are researchers who have that objective. Personally, I think that's abhorrent, I'll put it that strongly, because I think autism is part of a person's identity, and why would we want to sort of remove someone's identity or remove what makes them different and special? I think certainly I would welcome interventions or treatments that alleviate the disabling aspects. That's very different to saying we want to cure or eradicate or prevent autism, which some people do talk in those terms.
I was very interested in your experience of hearing seagulls and take one. It resonates with me. But the question that I actually want to ask to both of you is if there is a reciprocal relationship between synesthesia and autism. Are there relationships that exist in research? And also, for you, do you have a relationship between the way you're seeing or developing patterns and your experiences of synesthesia?
Very quickly, I don't know any different. Since a young child, I'd be frightened of someone in a yellow coat, or I'd go into a certain space and hear a humming noise and feel totally calm, or I would see a colour that would calm me, or a colour that would, I'd hate, or I'd hear things. You're the naughty child of 5, you screaming the house down because you've gone into a certain room, or your parents can't pull you out of it, and you can't explain why, because, I always thought everybody did that. I didn't know it was any different. Until I was shown, a colour blindness test, I didn't know that one eye I see slightly yellower than the other. I didn't know till, like I say, 40, till I happened to say to someone, I can't read that because it looks like it's underwater. So I was diagnosed with dyslexia and the vision effects that comes with. So, if you grow up with it and live with it and work alongside it, and it kind of relates almost to the last question too. If someone said, here's a pill that will take it all away and you'll be happy in crowds and things like that, I'd tell them to shove it. Because it's what makes me, me. And I wouldn't change the bullying at school because it gives me that drive and that different outlook on life. And, very funny, very quick story, slightly off it, but even last weekend, I explained to a guy in a hotel that I wasn't going to give him my credit card because someone else had paid for the room in case I smashed it up. Because for certain, I knew I wasn't going to smash the room up. There was no doubt about it. And it's just not my rule to give my bank details out to strangers. So he said, well, you can't come in there. And I said, well, I'm only doing this because I have Asperger's. And he said, oh, should you be out on your own?
Coming back to your question about synesthesia and autism, that was another way in which we kind of learned from Jon that he's got both, and you can have one without the other. But we decided after meeting Jon, to look into this a bit deeper and find out if synesthesia is more common in people with autism than it is in the general population. And we just finished that study finding that actually there is this connection, that synesthesia is more common in people with autism. So that's a study that's not yet published, but it's only just been completed. But it raises new questions. Why should there be this connection? And one possible answer is that both in synesthesia and in autism, there are differences in connections in the brain. So in synesthesia, we've heard that a sound can trigger a colour, or a touch can trigger a colour. So you've got connections between different sensory areas in the brain. And in autism, there's one view of the perception of people with autism, which is that they have maybe additional connections, extra or a greater number of nerve or neuronal connections between parts of the brain, which allow them to see more detail and experience the world in more detail. So that's not really addressing ultimate causes, which may be genetic and the way that the brain wires itself, but it's certainly giving us new ways of understanding autism and its relationship to other conditions.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna wind up for our event. I know that Simon has to rush off,
I know that Jon will be here for a little while longer, so if you'd like to have another break and sit around for half an hour before we throw you out, that'd be great. In the meantime, I'd like to thank Jon and Simon and also Lucas very much, and for you all for coming along.